And hello, everyone. Welcome from St. Louis, Missouri. My name is Tom Pansella of the Missouri Institute of Mental Health. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for our program on mental illness, spirituality, and faith. I'll introduce our speaker, Craig Renebohm, to you in just a moment. For those of you joining us online, if you'd like to ask questions at any time during the presentation, use the email questions for speaker link underneath the video window, and we will ask those questions on your behalf. You'll submit those to us via email. We'll hold those for the end of his presentation. We'll ask questions at the end, but you can submit them at any time. If you're interested in CEUs for today's program, there is an application link also underneath the video window for CEUs. You can use that anytime during the presentation. We've added a couple other links, including one for the Spring Training Institute for the Missouri Department of Mental Health. If you're anywhere in or around Missouri in May, we're going to be here down at the Lake of the Ozarks for the two-day program down there. And Craig is a speaker at that program as well. Topic slightly variant from this one, but I think you'll still enjoy his presentation there. So I would like to introduce Craig Renebohm, and he is a chaplain who has worked for the last 23 years on the streets of Seattle, Washington, with individuals who are homeless and struggling with serious mental illness, trauma, and addictions. He's provided spiritual care on the inpatient mental health units of the county hospital, consulted with community mental health center staff, and trained congregations, clergy, and treatment providers in the practices of companionship, a way of relational outreach, engagement, and support for healing and recovery. Craig has presented nationally and internationally, including doing trainings in Jamaica and Bosnia, and is the author of Souls in the Hands of a Tender God, Stories of the Search for Home and Healing on the Streets. And Craig, thanks for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Delighted to be here. Thank you for tuning in and being part of the audience. I want to begin with just a word or two of some background, introduce myself to you. And in that process, kind of help lay the foundation for what I'll be sharing with you. I came to Seattle in 1975 and was the pastor of Pilgrim Congregational Church near the downtown in Seattle. One of the things I found that when I got to Seattle was that there were folks who were homeless and mentally ill, literally living on the grounds of the church. We began to develop some sheltering, other survival programs, meals, drop-in center. And one of the things that became clear was that there were folks among the community of homeless individuals who had difficulty even making use of those survival services. There were people who were so depressed, or people who were so manic, or folks who were so paranoid and frightened in their schizophrenia that they had difficulty even getting to the door of the church to participate in a meal, much less connect with treatment and care resources. So my interest in connecting with folks who experience mental illness was heightened by that experience trying to work with folks who were homeless right around the church. One of the things I realized in that experience, beginning in the late 70s, was how unprepared we were, not only in our communities, but also in our congregations, to welcome and work with individuals who had experienced serious mental illness. As the institutions were closing down, we simply did not have the resources in our community to welcome and support folks, and we certainly were unprepared and have continued to struggle within faith communities to be up to speed on how to be helpful and supportive of persons who experience mental illness and to be of care to their families. I was at Pilgrim for about 12 years. In 1986, I spent a year in Berkeley doing some further graduate study to prepare for working full-time with folks who are experiencing serious mental illness and offering pastoral care and spiritual care with folks. As part of that program, I spent a summer as the chaplain on an inpatient psychiatric unit in the Bay Area. And I began to hear daily, as I worked with anywhere from a dozen to 15 people individually and in small groups, people would be raising very real spiritual and religious concerns. One man saying, do you think I'm God? Or another person asking, why is God punishing me? Or another person stating, I'm the 33rd plenipotentiary ambassador of the 14th holy universe. Or very simply, will you pray with me? Another man asking, is there any hope? One of the things that experience taught me, and that research is confirming, is that individuals who experience mental illness have often very pressing spiritual, religious questions and concerns, and that furthermore individuals consider spiritual resources, their connection to a faith community, to be near the top of the list or at the top of the list, supportive of their healing and recovery. In fact, Mark Gallanter, a psychiatrist at Bellevue Hospital in New York, did a study with colleagues in which he asked patients simply to fill out a form, listing in their view the importance of spiritual resources and other than more concrete things like medication, psychosocial education, support and therapy, work. And that study found that patients ranked spirituality at the top. That same instrument was given to staff. Staff tended to rate spirituality towards the bottom. And in fact, staff were also asked, what do you think, how important do you think spirituality is to the patients? And they also ranked spirituality as not necessarily very important to the patients. And yet both patients and staff endorse spirituality as important in their own lives. So this is a topic that, though we don't talk much about it or hasn't been a major issue among us, the place of spirituality in healing and recovery is of real importance both to the patient, the consumer, and it's an issue I think that those of us as caregivers need to have some understanding of the arena and realm of spirituality. There's also, I must say, a personal root to my interest in the intersection of spirituality and mental illness. When I was 20, I experienced a major depression. It was a pastor in our local church that really began the process of reaching out to me and beginning to work with me, connect me to other resources and care, and to companion me on the journey as I started toward healing and recovery. So I count the care of that local pastor as crucial in my own healing and recovery, and the continuing support that I got through the community of faith as important in my own healing and recovery. I think that spirituality is central and even basic for many of us who have struggled with a serious mental illness. When I went to seminary, I must say that there was very little in the way of training or introduction to serious mental illness. In fact, my pastoral care instructor in our basic course had one sentence to say about spirituality and mental illness. He said, if someone has a serious mental illness, refer them to a psychiatrist, period. That's great advice, but we didn't really learn about what mental illness was, and we certainly didn't get much encouragement or understanding of how a pastoral caregiver and clinicians might collaborate and work together. So over the years, and particularly through the work at Pacific School of Religion and in the last 23 years of being a mental health chaplain, I've begun to cobble together an understanding, drawing on pastoral counseling and the DMIN program in pastoral care, and conversations and in-service trainings with colleagues in the mental health field, building a knowledge of psychiatry, medicine, and neuroscience to blend with my understanding of spirituality, religion, and pastoral care. I think it's important for us to realize on both sides of the medical, psychological care side and the spiritual care side that we can have a common appreciation of the complexity of the human brain. 100 billion cells organized to give us our potential for physical activity, sensation, emotional experience, our capacity to learn, have language, use ideas, draw on memory. Our brain gives us the capacity for making personal choices and decisions. In our brain lies the capacity and potential for us to begin and develop relationships with others. And in the brain lies our capacity for imagination, mystery, awe, and wonder. Perhaps more than any other part of the body, the brain provides a foundation for our spirituality, the rich life of the soul. Well, as I work on the mental health units, on the inpatient units, and as I've worked on the streets with folks who are struggling with mental health issues, it's clear that mental illnesses change the brain structure and functioning. The brain cells and circuits are malfunctioning, and certain symptom patterns emerge: depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. And these symptoms may have a spiritual or religious content. Symptoms of a mental illness may borrow from religious symbols, from religious ideas, from spiritual experience, or the symptoms may be distortions or disruptions of our usual spiritual experience. I'll just give you a quick example. I mentioned the man who raised the question, do you think I'm God? In an episode of mania, this euphoric, expansive, grandiose state that this man was in gave him a sense that perhaps he was the universe, or in control of the universe, was perhaps God. When he posed that question, the response that was made that said, well, no, I think there's a little bit of God in all of us, but no, I don't think you're God. He said, oh, what a relief. But that's an example that in the course of illness, the symptoms of mania took the form of borrowed religious content and imagery and idea. On the other hand, I worked with another man who thought he was Jimi Hendrix, the musician. So in the course of illness, our brains may go in different directions in developing the symptoms, and sometimes those directions include spiritual or religious content. There was a gentleman that came to me saying, you know, whenever I'm in the shower and the water is on, I hear God's voice telling me I'm unclean. You're unclean. You're unclean. You can never be clean. He said, is that God telling me that I'm just, you know, worthless and have done something that I just can never overcome? And I approached the man with this way to say, you know, the experience that you're having, the hearing of a voice and thinking that it may be God, or even that voice saying it's God, is a real human experience. You're not the first one, you aren't the only one to have that kind of experience. The question for us is whether that voice is coming from some external reality or whether your brain is creating that voice in you. We know from research, from PET scans, that a person could be in an absolutely quiet room, be hearing voices, and the voice systems and centers of the brain will be activated, although there's no external stimuli. That's a hallucination. And so I opened up the possibility with this man that his experience could be a hallucination, a symptom of a mental disorder, or possibly, as he was suggesting, it was not a symptom of a mental disorder, but some actual spiritual experience. I held both of those as possibilities with the man as I began, but began to do some education, learn from him that he had other symptoms of schizophrenia, indeed had been treated for schizophrenia in the past. And as we talked, he began to accept and understand and even be ready to seek treatment and care for his symptoms as signs of an episode of schizophrenia. Worked with another man who had symptoms of being levitated, lifted up off the bed, and attributed that to the activity of aliens. He went into the bathroom and looked in the mirror, couldn't see his face. Those same aliens, he believed, had taken his face from him. At the same time he was lying in bed in this distress, family members gathered, a priest came, and they prayed, and this man had a palpable sense of the presence of the Virgin Mary, offering him comfort and encouragement. When he reported all this in the hospital setting, staff was interested in having some assessment as to what of this report was valid, perhaps spiritual experience, and what of it were indeed signs of schizophrenia symptoms of hallucination. And I talked with our senior chaplain at the time, who had come from the Philippines and was also, that was the cultural experience of the young man and his families. And the senior chaplain said, well, it's very common in our culture and tradition that people will have an experience of the presence of the Virgin Mary. I would not see that as a sign or symptom of mental disorder or schizophrenia. The other two pieces that he's reporting, yes, symptoms, signs of mental illness. So a beginning piece of work in pastoral care is to help assess the nature of the symptoms that a person is reporting, particularly in sorting out what the nature of these symptoms that have spiritual religious content is. Another example, we had a fellow who had responded to treatment, and his psychiatrist came to me about 2 weeks into his care and said, I'm concerned that maybe the patient is relapsing. And he said, look at this letter that I got. It's full of some very, very strange and unusual and disturbing images. And I began reading the letter, and I recognized right away what the letter was. This young man had copied from the book of Revelation passages describing the end of the world, great battles and torments. And subtly at the very beginning he said, this is what my illness is like. He was borrowing from his religious spiritual tradition to try and communicate his experience, what the symptoms of his illness were like. He was not having a relapse. Indeed, that letter was indication that he was becoming more perceptive about the nature of his illness and was trying to communicate what it was like. So a first pastoral care, spiritual care task is to help consumers, individuals who are experiencing symptoms of mental illness, to sort out what is of the illness and what is of an authentic spiritual, religious faith experience. A second spiritual care task is to explore with people how we explain this experience of mental illness. A woman asked me some years ago, she said, Chaplain, why am I ill? And I said, well, what have your care team, has your care team said? What have your doctors and nurses and caseworkers said to you? She said, I don't mean that. I understand that I have some brain disorder, the neurotransmitters. I mean, I've had that education, and I understand that. But I'm asking a different question. Why is it that I became ill? Why me? And so this can be a subtle question. How do people explain their illness experience? Sometimes a person may draw on their religious spiritual framework to say, well, I'm a bad person, I've done something wrong, therefore God is punishing me, and the symptoms of my depression or what I'm going through are a function of divine punishment. I had one consumer say to me, I've committed the unpardonable sin. I'm going through all this suffering because I did something so horrific, so bad that I can never be forgiven. And I thought to myself, that would have to be pretty serious. And we have some understanding of that in the tradition out of which this young woman comes. And so, but I asked her, what did you do? And she said, well, I stopped going to Bible study each week. I kind of smiled. I said, well, if all of us who stopped going to church or Bible study we're going to be punished for that at the level you are, I mean, there'd be a lot of us suffering, but I don't think it was that act that caused your serious depression. I think there's another explanation that may be more helpful in understanding the symptoms of your depression. And so we talked, in her case, about the biology. So these two examples, wrestling with this question of why am I ill? What has caused this illness? Is an area where often spirituality and matters of faith connect or come up against other models of explanation, medical, psychological, and the pastoral caregiver, the spiritual caregiver, can help sort out what's what on that to develop these multiple explanatory frameworks. A third spiritual care task is to help inform people about spiritual practices that will be helpful to their healing and recovery. I'll give you a very simple example. A person came in to me before the holiday season several years ago and said, I know that when I get stressed, that makes me more vulnerable to the symptoms of my illness. And the holidays, Christmas, the New Year's, these are just heavy-duty times. There are a lot of expectations. It's not a good time for me, and what can you suggest that would be helpful to me? And I found myself just taking a deep breath in sympathy and empathy with this friend. And I was reminded that in a number of traditions, the most basic word for spirit is simply breath, movement of air, as an image of the spirit. And I said, well, there is something called a breath prayer. If you just breathe in, and breathe in as you breathe in a thought or word that is good, refreshing, nourishing, helpful. Breathe in love. And then as you exhale, breathe out some care or condition you want to let go of. Your anxiety, your fear, expectations. That's a breath prayer. And so you don't even have to put the words to it, just breathe. And she reported back after the holiday season that at some times of significant stress, she would just take a moment or two to breathe. And we know from some studies and work done by Herbert Benson that some of this just deep breathing begins to energize a whole relaxation response in us, just as stimuli can also set us off to alert. So it's an illustration that there may be even the most simple of spiritual practices may be helpful to the healing and recovery process. On a little more complex note, we had a fellow who was going into the hospital over a period of 2 years, would go in just after the New Year and just after the Easter holidays. And over 2 years working with this fellow, it became clear that he was vulnerable to episodes of mania in his bipolar disorder, and that a couple of things happened in these high holiday times. He would just encourage himself and get involved in all of the sort of spiritual high holy day practices that he could find at some of our largest churches with huge organs and brass choirs and large congregations, and he'd be caught up in the joy and euphoria that was there in the faith community, and it would feel so good that he would also then stop using his medication. The combination of the stimuli of the high holidays, stopping his medication, he would begin to sky up, and then after everything was over, he would experience an episode of depression. So in the third year, I was working with the fellow, and I suggested to him that before Christmas this year, that he spend the Christmas season with a little mission church in his faith tradition. And he looked at me and he sort of disappointed. He said, well, they don't even have an organ. I said, no, they don't even have a piano. They just use a guitar. He said, well, I don't think that's going to be much fun. And they don't have a choir. I said, no, just the congregational singing isn't all that great sometimes either. But he went. And he discovered a different high holy day experience, something that was much more down to earth, more concrete, and what I think was much more appropriate given his vulnerability to episodes of mania. So a part of the work of spiritual care is to help consumers, patients, clients find those spiritual practices which will be most helpful and supportive of their recovery and healing. And then finally, spiritual care has to do with helping people open to issues of meaning and purpose. An episode of serious mental illness, prolonged and serious mental illness, can profoundly affect our life journey. We may not be able to do all of the things we had hoped we could do. We may not be able to do all of the things we used to do, just like folks who have heart attacks. We may have to change our lifestyle, adjust to this vulnerability. And issues then of what good am I? What can I do? What's the meaning of my life? What's the purpose of my existence? begin to come up in the course of healing and recovery. And there's no pill, there's no talk therapy that ultimately helps us address our deepest issues of meaning and purpose and calling. But that is precisely the issues and the subject matter of the realm of the spiritual. Who are we most deeply? What are we called to do and be in relationship to others? What's the meaning of our lives in this vast universe? Those are our spiritual, religious questions, and the appropriate care of the spiritual caregiver. And it's addressing these questions of assessing symptoms, of exploring explanations, of informing folks about what spiritual practices may be most helpful, and opening up these issues of meaning and purpose, these AEIO pastoral care tasks that are the work of the chaplain, the spiritual care department, the pastor, priest, imam, spiritual leader, rabbi. I have learned to attend to those spiritual care tasks using a way of companionship. And I define companionship as a response to suffering, a relationship that's supportive of healing and recovery, and it's a way of being with a person that's not something we do sort of privately and intimately so much as a relationship that we share in public, on the street, in the drop-in center, talking together in a coffee shop, after services on at the church or synagogue or temple, mosque. Companionship is a way of being with another person that attends to the spiritual issues and concerns that come up in an individual's life. There are 5 basic practices of companionship that I use. One is the practice of hospitality. Henry Nouwen calls hospitality creating safe space with the stranger. Particularly on the street or when I meet someone for the first time, I just try and create safe space between us and with us. Hospitality also involves treating another person with basic respect and dignity. From a spiritual perspective, I see each person as infinitely worthy and valuable. So that spirituality informs my hospitality. Hospitality can also involve, nurture and nourishment, refreshment. So sometimes as I'm meeting with someone, I say, would you like to get a cup of tea or coffee or just a drink of water? So that in hospitality, we're not only creating the safe space, but we're signaling a respect and dignity and indicating our interest in nourishment and support for another. The second practice of companionship and pastoral care is what I call neighboring. Now, I can start in an introduction of myself with who I am as a person. And I told you at the beginning a little bit about my professional history. We can introduce ourselves in terms of our personal history or our professional roles, but we can also introduce ourselves to each other simply as neighbors. We're people in this room sharing this space. Even those of you who are tuning in through the internet, we have common ground on this planet. We are neighbors even at a great distance. And as neighbors, what's most fundamentally true about us is you're a human being and I'm a human being. And I think that's where spiritual care starts. It takes off some of our hats of professionalism or personal background and difference and seeks to make the relationship, build the relationship on the basis of our common human experience as neighbors, the common ground of one human being and another human being. The third practice of companionship, and key to, I think, spiritual care, is to share the journey side by side. Rather than confronting a person with their illness, or the symptoms that they're struggling with, or with recommendations for treatment and care, I try and begin by standing alongside the person and looking out at the world together. Our common humanity, we're looking out, and I'm interested in what you're seeing, particularly in your experience with illness, and to standing with you and to walking with you together as we look at possibilities for healing and recovery, what the struggles are, what the barriers are that you may face. So I work side by side with folks. A fourth spiritual practice is listening. And among the practice, in the practice of listening, I'm particularly interested as a spiritual caregiver in listening for the language of hope, for the language of love in a person's life, for the language of faith. What do you hold on to in the end? What's most important to you? What's central? What's basic to your being? What do you most deeply believe? And finally, in listening, I'm interested in what I call the soul story. Who are you at your deepest and most core as a person? How do you put your life together in terms of where you've been, where you are now, and where you're headed? What's your spiritual story? What's the deepest narrative framework of your life and being? And then as I listen to a person's story, I begin to see what the needs and issues are in their life. And it's not that I come in to, meet all those needs, but I can be available to accompany the person. That's the fifth practice. How can I walk with you as you identify the next steps in your journey and begin to move out, particularly as you identify relationships to others that can be part of your care team? Because I think that none of us heal and recover without a circle of support. We don't live without a circle of others who give us encouragement, help, support. We need to be part of community. And so accompaniment is a practical practice of helping introduce folks to others who can be supportive and supporting people in building a circle of care. One of the things I understand, I think, about healing and recovery is that when you see me in the midst of my depression, and I can barely talk, and I feel terrible about who I am, I have no hope, I'm just shut down, you are seeing what I call my illness self. You are seeing the symptoms that are dominating my experience right now, that are being driven by my disorder. So you see my illness self. But remember, behind that illness self is the person that I've been, and the potential I have, again, to be a whole person, to heal and recover. So healing is about helping reduce the symptoms, the power of the illness over the person, through medication and therapy and care. But as the symptoms are lifted or reduced, more of my potential as a healthy self emerges. And so caregiving is both receiving and understanding the illness self, the symptoms, the disease, the disorder, and attempting to relieve those symptoms and restore functioning in order that the more fulsome whole person can emerge. And one of the keys, I think, particularly with chronic mental illness, is that even though I return to a degree of health and well-being, included in my wholeness is also my vulnerability to illness. Included in my wholeness is also that past experience of the illness itself. And so healing involves not only the reducing of the symptoms or the diminishment of the illness, but healing also includes where do we hold that in ourselves now? How do we understand it? How does it become part of our new wholeness, our ongoing life? So healing and recovery for me is always a process, a movement toward wholeness. Well, I've used all along in this conversation words like spirit, spirituality, faith, soul, religion. Let me take a moment and try and define with you in a couple of different ways what we mean by spirituality. One way of looking at spirituality is a holistic perspective. This is suggested by Ed Kanda, professor of social work. And Kanda sets out a holistic version or perspective on spirituality in which he says spirituality can be the center of a person's life. Spirituality can be a dimension of a person's life, or spirituality may be the context, the whole surround in which a person exists and lives. So this is a social science perspective on spirituality. Ed can listen and say to a person and help them understand that their spirituality may be a center point, an anchor in their life. Or a person may be talking about their spirituality in terms of it's a dimension of their life, also like gender, or like the work they do, or being a parent. Spirituality is a part of their whole experience. Or spirituality may be expressed in terms of the whole universe and set of relationships in which a person moves. Notice that in this holistic sort of social science perspective on spirituality, a person's spirituality can be quite unique. People can have different spiritualities, come from very different traditions, and the social worker, the clinician, the mental health provider is simply trying to understand where and how spirituality is a part of this person's life. Is it at the center? Is it an aspect of their life? Is it something that is providing a whole context for the person? Kanda also talks about a functional definition of spirituality. We can look at a person's spirituality in terms of certain basic spiritual functions. What does this person believe? What is this person's tradition of spiritual life and practice? What are the important spiritual practices in this person's situation? Where are they connected to a faith community? How do they deal or understand religious authority? These are functions of spiritual activity and experience, and that's a second way to look at spirituality in terms of this functional view or approach. Pulchowski has suggested a very simple way for clinicians to ask after the spiritual issues that a person may be facing. She calls FICA, and it simply means asking F, what's a person's faith and belief system about healing and recovery? I, what's the importance of faith in that person's life? C, what community of faith does this person belong to or hold important in their lives? And A, pay attention to whatever unmet needs in the spiritual arena this person may have. So the clinician doesn't have to be an expert on understanding spirituality or be a spiritual caregiver, but any of us can ask those sort of four questions. FICA, what are your faith beliefs about healing and recovery? How important is faith to you? Are you part of a community of faith? And is there anything I can do to listen or hear any questions or concerns you have, spiritual or religious issues that are in your life? Finally, I want to suggest that spiritual caregivers may have more specific definitions coming out of their own background or tradition about spirituality, faith, soul, and religion. And in fact, those can become quite specific in particular spiritual traditions. I want to share with you just a sort of pastoral approach to spirituality that I use as a general spiritual caregiver. I understand spirituality to refer to the deepest movement of life and love in our existence. So when you ask me as a spiritual caregiver, what's spirituality all about? I can talk to you about a holistic view or a functional view. I can share with you Pulchowski's FICA approach. But if you ask me most deeply, how do I approach my spirituality? I talk about spirituality for me involving the deepest movement of love and life in our existence. What does faith mean to you, Craig? faith means to me, it refers to our experience of the spiritual. Faith has to do with our experience of the sacred and the holy. Well, Craig, how would you define soul? As a spiritual caregiver out of a particular tradition, I would define soul as our spiritual identity taking shape over time and in eternity. Well, what do you mean by religion, Craig? I would say that religion refers to a shared spiritual story, a shared set of beliefs and practices, tradition and truth. But when I'm defining spirituality in this pastoral framework, I'm acknowledging that these definitions are informed by my particular tradition, spiritual background, and training. And I would not impose those definitions on you, because you, each of you, will develop your own understanding of spirituality, your own understanding of what you mean when you say faith, or I'm a faithful person, your own understanding of soul or spiritual identity, and you will choose and be part of your own particular spiritual, religious community and tradition. So I think it's important, whether we're spiritual caregivers or clinicians, to try and be clear about our own personal definitions of spirituality, faith, soul, religion, and not simply impose those on others or expect that others are going to see spirituality in the same way. So one of the pieces of common ground that we have in terms of spirituality is that we may have different views as caregivers, as consumers, patients, clients. One of the challenges, I think, is for us to recognize that spirituality is a very personal and often subjective dimension of human experience, and be prepared to be open and tolerant of some range of differences and different points of views. Including the fact that even though a person may believe that they have the only truth, that at the clinical level or the spiritual caregiving level with others, it may be helpful to say, this is what I believe, but I want to hold open to where you are and what you're struggling with. Spirituality involves different approaches, different views of the nature of human experience. Spirituality, I think, those of us who are involved in this spiritual care work also need to realize and understand that the field of medicine, psychiatry, the field of psychology, therapy, these are also ways of looking at the human experience, ways of understanding parts of the human existence and struggle and journey. And it isn't that medicine over here, or spirituality over here, or psychology over there, or social sciences over here, one has all the answers. Human beings are extraordinarily complex. We are rich beings. And so each of these fields, spirituality, psychology, social sciences more largely, psychiatry, medicine, all of us as caregivers have windows in to what's going on with a person. All of us have gifts to bring to the healing and recovery process. Let me close with two final items. One is to share with you just some thoughts about what the role of faith groups are in the community mental health system and community mental health care. I think that faith groups, spiritual communities, religious groups have 5 kinds of responsibilities. One responsibility we have in our faith communities is to learn and be knowledgeable about mental illness, substance abuse, trauma, children's mental health issues, to learn from research and from other fields of human wisdom, and to share what we've learned to do education in our wider faith communities and in our larger neighborhood settings. So education is a role for faith communities about mental illness, trauma, abuse, substance abuse, children's mental health issues. The second role we have is to build not only awareness, but develop also among us in our faith communities a commitment to care. Many of us in our faith communities have been very much like the larger society. We've been prisoners of our own stigma and misunderstanding, and we have kept often people and families struggling with mental illness at the edge or outside the community of faith. I think we have the responsibility to build a commitment of care. That leads then to a third task, and that's to welcome individuals who experience mental illness and their families into the life of the community of faith. We have a responsibility, I think, to collaborate with community mental health caregivers to offer what support we can. That may mean some specialized small groups, but perhaps the most important thing we can do in our faith communities is to be a place where a person can experience sort of the normal range of human life and relationships. I spent some time at a town named Giel in Belgium, which for 7 centuries has welcomed folks with serious mental illness into people's homes. Family care is the way they do healing and recovery in Giel. And I was asking the chaplain there, well, what special programs do faith groups in Giel have for those who are mentally ill? And he looked at me and said, well, I can't think of any. I thought, well, that's too bad. They don't reach out or do it. He said, no, that's not it. He said, people who have mental illness and are living with families are just like anybody else in the congregation. They help with things. They come to events. They're part of study groups. They usher. They're just part of the community. And I thought that's kind of the ideal that we can aspire to in our faith communities with respect to persons and families who have struggled with mental illness. We can be places in our faith groups where folks are welcome just to be who they are. Finally, I think faith groups can be part of the mission of advocacy to help build a more adequate community mental health system, a more accessible community mental health system. And so as we learn and work with our sisters and brothers who struggle with mental illness, as we invite families into our life together in communities of faith, we can become part of the advocacy movement for better care. Let me finally suggest some resources that may be helpful to you in discovering more about this intersection of spirituality, faith, and mental illness. I work here in St. Louis with a group called Pathways to Promise. Their website is www.pathways2promise. Pathways to Promise has a website that includes a variety of resource materials for clergy, individuals, congregations, including just recently published toolkit for congregations that suggests month-by-month activities and resources that can be available to support those activities of education and commitment, welcome, support, and advocacy. So the toolkit for local congregations, I think, is a tremendous resource available from Pathways to Promise. Pathways also has on its website many of the presentations and program materials from a conference that was held end of last September here in St. Louis. It brought together people from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the Center for Mental Health Services, the American Psychiatric Association, pastors, lay leaders, community mental health providers came together for an intensive 2.5-day conference. And the presentations at that conference, the models that were shared, are also all available on the Pathways site. A second website that I think may be helpful for you is the NAMI FaithNet site. You can go to NAMI and click into the FaithNet site. FaithNet has collected a wide range of resources, listing of resources and sample materials that can be useful particularly to clergy and congregations. And the FaithNet group nationally is developing an effort to train members of local affiliates to carry the message about mental illness and the role of congregations into the local faith communities. Finally, let me mention 3 or 4 books. Harold Koenig's Handbook of Religion and Health, Mark Gallanter's book, Spirituality and the Healthy Mind, Ed Canda's book, Spiritual Diversity and Social Work, and Nancy Kehoe's recently published book, Wrestling with Our Inner Angels. All of these are authors who have worked on the intersection of spirituality and mental illness and have written from various perspectives, as psychiatrists, as social worker, as a psychologist and Roman Catholic sister, in the case of Nancy Kehoe, on the subject of spirituality and mental illness. I think you'll find any and all of those books helpful. Finally, let me just say a word about a new program that's emerging here in the St. Louis area that Pathways to Promise is helping foster, and that is the development of a mental health training cooperative. And this is a model of training local congregations, local faith groups, clergy, to become more involved in working with those who experience mental illness. The model's really quite simple. There's a curriculum of some informal conversations, 2 core courses, a Mental Health 101 aimed at assisting clergy to develop a deeper understanding of mental illness, substance abuse, trauma, children's mental health issues. Several foundation courses, by the way, a core course for clergy and a companionship core course for laity, and then 2 foundation courses, longer courses, 8 to 12 hour courses that help develop specific skills and programs in a local church, and then a curriculum of ongoing continuing education available on specific topics. So the cooperative at that level is trying to develop a curriculum. Second thing the cooperative is trying to do is to organize groups of faith groups, congregations to work together in neighborhoods so that no one faith group has to do all of this alone. And so clergy can meet with each other and with clinicians on a monthly basis to talk about issues and concerns that come up and how to share care. Companions, local faith leaders, lay leaders can work together on developing mental health teams and companionship groups in their local churches. And so that's an emerging model, being able to take some of the resources that are available nationally and more regionally on spirituality and mental health and move them in an effective way into local neighborhoods and communities. I close with this story. Ken Thompson at the conference in October described an experience he'd had. He was on staff at a state hospital. At that state hospital on Sunday mornings, 12, a dozen or 15 patients got together for a morning service each weekend of spiritual support. They've been doing it for years. When the state hospital closed, Ken asked the question, where are these 12 to 15 folks going to get their spiritual care and support? Where are they going to connect as they're being sent back out into the community? And that became a challenge for him, and a challenge that he is continuing to work with as he does work at the national and regional level. And I think what we're all about, now that community mental health is what's happening, how do we equip those in our communities, faith groups, pastoral leaders, and our communities of faith to be centers of support for healing and recovery? A little longer than I had anticipated, but I'd be glad to take any questions. Tom?
Yeah, we do actually have a couple of questions that have come in, Craig. First one says, I'm a recovering mental health consumer, a certified peer specialist, an ordained minister, and a spiritual activist. I believe my remission of symptoms came from and comes from learning to relate to others. So my question is, would you support a course program or curriculum that helps consumers better understand their spiritual relationship with others?
Absolutely. One of the privileges I had in serving the inpatient units at our county hospital was to do a spiritual support group, and just to provide a time where we could come in and be in a time of quiet together, and then different folks in the group might share spiritual resources from their life or tradition. And then we had a time where people could raise questions or share experiences about what had been helpful to them in terms of spiritual support and resources. And then we ended with some time again of quiet where people could kind of open up to their own spiritual depths and resources and consider next steps. And a number of people said this was really the first time that they had in their illness experience an opportunity to talk about spirituality with others. And so the spiritual support group in the hospital was an important step in not only their own individual spiritual life, but discovering that this was an area of conversation, exploration they could open up with others. We've done spiritual support groups in local congregations. And again, I think that the opportunity to share and explore spiritual issues, concerns, questions, steps is very helpful to the recovery process. I would encourage some kind of additional models and the spread of those models of spiritual care and support groups.
All right. She writes, I am an adoption caseworker with a Christian adoption agency. I work with young women making an adoption plan for their unborn child. Some of these women present with mental illnesses. How can I best walk through the process with them and help the adoptive parents develop a relationship with the birth mother of their child?
If I'm understanding the question, it's the birth mothers.
The birth mother presents with mental illness. She wants to walk through the process with them and help the adoptive parents develop a relationship with the birth mother.
I think that that's an important issue and challenge, and I think addressing holistically the potential needs of that adopted child, that there may be physical issues, medical issues that this child may be vulnerable to. There may be social emotional issues that this child will struggle with, or there may be a difference in cultural background. The person may come, the birth mother may be from, or parents may be from a different spiritual religious background. So I think if in any time we have an opportunity, we can open up the richness and complexity of a person, and in this case then say, there have been some issues, mental health issues in the family of origin with this child, and make that an area of education for the adoptive parents. We know from twin studies and research that there can be some genetic predisposition to a mental illness. And I think only fair to the adoptive parents to say this may be something to bear in mind, to take a look at. If mom, for instance, had been using substances, particularly alcohol, during pregnancy, there may be a possibility of fetal alcohol syndrome or disorder, and that it may be important to help adoptive parents be equipped to deal with mental health issues or the sequelae of mental health issues, just as we look at other aspects of that child's life that may impact the adoptive parents. Part of this, I think, means we have to keep working at breaking down the stigma around mental illness, and rather than avoiding discussing it, know that it both is a reality in our lives. Some people are more vulnerable than others to episodes of mental illness, and there is treatment and care. So education, I think, and bringing this up, looking at it in the light of day is an important step.
And this may be either a yes/no question or an entire another hour. Do you believe that all of humanity is on a spiritual journey into reactualizing their relationship with each other?
I would be open to a conversation around that for sure. My bias is that, as perhaps Ed Candace suggests, spirituality is at least a dimension of all of our lives. And that all of us as human beings face questions of deep meaning, ultimate purpose. I guess the other thing I would say, and this is what I guess spiritual folks do, and that is we've finally come to make statements of faith. There are things I cannot prove, I cannot give ultimate evidence for, but my faith is, and this informs my work in the end with people, I do have a hope rooted in a sense that there is a spirit of healing at work in every moment and occasion of our lives, and that there is a spirit of healing that's at work even in the most microscopic levels of our brains and being. Ultimately, that's mystery, and I can only assert it on behalf of a sense of hope for our human community.
And thank you so much. Well, we'd like to thank Craig for his time and his expertise today. It was an excellent talk today.
Thank you, Tom.
We'd like to thank all of you for your attention today, those who joined us in the room today, those who joined us online. It was a good turnout. And keep an eye on our website for upcoming programs. Our next program is February 17th, I believe. It's Nutrition and Mental Health. But there's always things that pop up onto the program. And keep an eye on speakers that may be present at the Department of Mental Health Spring Training Institute, because we may audition some of them in this format for you, so you can enjoy them ahead of that program and see that you do indeed want to get to that program. So again, if you're interested in CEUs, we'll leave that application open for a little while. We're going to collect some of the references that Craig gave us, including those book titles, and we'll include those in our follow-up email to you later on, probably first thing tomorrow morning. So look for that from us as well. Again, thank you for your time, and Craig, thanks for yours.
Thank you, Tom.